For our daily devotion today, we're finishing up Deuteronomy chapter 4. We're studying Deuteronomy because the Bible tells us that this is the book that the kings of Israel were supposed to study throughout their time and in their reign as kings. So there's probably some really good stuff for us to remember in here as well. We're finishing up the chapter, and if you want to follow along with the text, you can do that in the description of the YouTube video or podcast, or open another tab if you're watching somewhere else. If you like what you're finding here, make sure you share it with somebody so that they can find it as well. And this text that we're going to go through has a bunch of names in it as it's kind of been the case throughout Deuteronomy that you probably don't know because they're geographic locations of the Near East 2,000 or more years ago. If you want some help figuring out where those places are, you can go to the link that's in the description of the YouTube video and podcast, openbible.info/geo, and you'll be able to actually track those things on a map. So I'll read the text, and I encourage you to follow along, and then we'll talk about it. Ask now about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created human beings on the earth. Ask from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of the fire as you have and lived? Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testings, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. Besides him there is no other. From heaven he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words from out of the fire. Because he loved your ancestors and chose their descendants after them, he brought you out of Egypt by his presence and his great strength to drive out before you nations greater and stronger than you, and to bring you into their land and to give it to you as a foreign inheritance, as it is today. Acknowledge and take to heart this day that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. Keep his decrees and commands, which I am giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land the Lord your God gives you for all time. Then Moses set aside 3 cities east of the Jordan, to which anyone who had killed a person could flee if they had unintentionally killed a neighbor without malice aforethought. They could flee into one of those cities and save their life. The cities were these: Bezer in the wilderness plateau for the Reubenites, Ramoth in Gilead for the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan for the Manassites. This is the law Moses set before the Israelites. These are the stipulations, decrees, and laws Moses gave them when they came out of Egypt, and were in the valley near Beth Peor, east of the Jordan, in the land of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, and who was defeated by Moses and the Israelites as they came out of Egypt. They took possession of his land and the land of Og, king of Bashan, the 2 Amorite kings east of the Jordan. This land extended from Aroer on the rim of the Arnon Gorge to Mount Sirion, that is Hermon, and included all of the Arabah east of the Jordan, as far as the Dead Sea below the slopes of Pisgah. This is God's word. So the beginning of this text, starting at verse 32, is where Moses lays out, essentially, look at your God and compare him to any other god of any of the other nations around you. Has your God done all these things? Has your God actually shown up to you in fire and spoken to you with audible words? Has your God pulled out your nation from another nation like our God did in Egypt? No, that's the rhetorical answer. Our God is a unique God. And I think this is also an important thing for us to remember as New Testament Christians. The Old Testament Christians had these sort of foundational moments that God had shown himself and shown his power and said, here I am, here's what I'm doing for you, here are my promises, my covenants, so trust me moving forward. Our God has done the same thing, that same God, for New Testament Christianity in the person of Jesus Christ. And so we can say, as New Testament Christians, has anyone been like our God, who has actually stepped into history, who has died in our place, who has made himself vulnerable, has made himself historically verifiable? No other God has done that. Our God is the only one who has made himself vulnerable, killable, historically verifiable, and human. And because of that, we know that our God is unique and is the only true God, because he actually shows up. He actually does what he sets out to do. So you have that promise, Christian, which is an awesome thing. After this, he says, this is verse 39, it says, acknowledge and take to heart this day that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. Keep his decrees and commands, which I am giving you today, so that it will go well with you and your children after you, and you may live long in the land the Lord your God gives you for all time. So a couple things we want to pull out of here. First of all, the idea of keeping the commands and decrees. This is something that comes up time and time again, but we need to keep harping on it because I think as North American Christians, we don't always remember that this is what God calls us to as Christians. But our primary relationship with God is of him speaking and us listening. And this word keep really helps us remember that our action, our response to God speaking is just to remember the words. Keep them. Don't forget them. Make sure that we're teaching them to other people, of course, but our relationship with God is not one of primary obedience, right? God doesn't tell us things so that we do things. That does happen. That's a result. But primarily, God tells us things so that we believe things. And actually, this was really highlighted for me as I was listening to one commentator on this text when he said there is really no Hebrew word for the idea of obey. So like when someone commands you to do something and you do that thing, they actually have more of words of like hearing and listening or hearing and trusting than they do of obedience. That's because I think Hebrew was born out of the culture that was in touch with the true God. And so as language kind of shapes itself around the culture, you've heard this old story of how Eskimos have like 5 different words for snow. Well, the same thing happened in the Hebrew culture. In their relationship with God, they thought of their relationship as one of God speaking and we listen and trust. And like that's going to lead us to do some things. But the thing that's happening is him speaking, us leading and trusting, or listening and trusting. Their language started to reflect that. And they didn't have a word for obedience in the way that we think of obedience, where you command somebody to do something and they go and do it. Now, I think this takes a little bit of parsing, so stick with me here. They are actually the same thing, right? Like obedience in an English sense, if I tell my daughter, throw that in the garbage. She has to hear me, and then she has to believe that what I'm saying is actually what I want, and that it's true, and that command is good for her. So she has to do like a listening and a faith thing, and then her actions will follow. But the thing that I think makes it really interesting for us is that in English, we have an emphasis on the action, and in Hebrew, they have an emphasis on the belief. And I believe that it's a little bit more biblical to say that our relationship with God is one of he speaks, we believe first. I hope that brings that out for you. The other thing that's interesting here is just the last words of this text. And that is that the Lord your God gives you this land for all time. There are a lot of things made, a lot of teachings made about, the nation of Israel, the nation state of Israel, the land on which Jerusalem lies today, and its relationship to Israel, and that hope for the future. And there's a lot of eschatological, that's basically like end times talk that goes with this. And some people will say it's a text like this that says, God gives the Israelites that land for all time. That means that even now in 2020, that land belongs to Israel. And I would just say that that's not true, because that's not part of the covenant that lasts for all time. This all-time language is contingent on them keeping the Lord as their God, which obviously they deny his covenant, rebel against him, worship other gods, and they do repent, and God does bring them back to the land, but they have broken the covenant. And so in the same way that, for example, my aunt, this is a kind of interesting story, but my aunt gave me a deal. She said, if you never drink underage, I'll give you $500 when you get to legal drinking age. And so if I had, if I drank before that age, it didn't matter if I didn't drink after that, I wouldn't have got the $500 because I broke the covenant, right? Well, God is doing the exact same thing. He says, here's what I'm going to give you if you remain faithful to me. But if you don't remain faithful to me, that doesn't mean I'm not going to forgive you. That doesn't mean I'm not going to love you and want to bring you back, but you broke the covenant. And so this promise for your land for all time is just not going to be true. I'm going to make this new body built into the person of Jesus Christ, not connected to a geographic location. Then the last part of this is just the introduction to chapter 5, when we're going to talk through the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments, of course, are a big deal, and so we'll probably slow down a little bit more on those things. But it's just a recounting of the history that we already talked through in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and 2. I skipped one thing, and I think this is really important. The cities of refuge. Sorry, I missed this. Verses 41 to 43. You can read about this in Numbers 35 is where you should actually go to look at Numbers 35. But I'll just give you a quick overview of it because it's a beautiful picture of God's grace. Moses had, by God's command, set up a couple cities where if somebody unintentionally killed somebody, they could run there so that the person who would try to get vengeance on them could not get vengeance on them. They're kind of like sanctuary cities. Maybe you can think of it that way. The interesting thing about these sanctuary cities is that you could go there and you could stay there and you could not have revenge taken on you until you had a trial. And if you stayed there after your trial and you were acquitted, because it was unintentional or whatever the case may be, you would have to stay there until the high priest died. And then you could leave. And you can read about this in Numbers 35, and read about what that looks like. But the picture for us is that we have sin. And obviously, some of it is not unintentional. It is very intentional. But what we can do is we can run to the sanctuary city of the church, and in the death of Jesus, the true high priest, be acquitted from those sins and be allowed to go free. And so you already see the echoes, the types, the pictures of Jesus in these Old Testament texts. So I'd encourage you, if you want a little bit extra study today, to go check out Numbers 35 and hear those Cities of Refuge texts. But for now, I'm appreciating that you're joining me for a daily devotion, and I hope you join me next time. Thanks, and if you want to see some other things that we're doing, you can click on the links that are on the screen if you're watching on YouTube.